So think back, if you will, to that recent period, those nightly air battles between India and Pakistan. It felt pretty tense. And depending on where you got your news, you might have seen some really extraordinary stories.
That's right, especially if you were watching Indian broadcast news channels. The picture painted there, it seems, could be wildly different from what reliable sources suggest actually happened.
Wildly different is maybe putting it mildly. It really begs the question, doesn't it? What happens when the news we consume just doesn't line up with reality?
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've got this fascinating piece from The Economist that really focuses on the reporting by Indian broadcast news during that specific time frame. The aim here isn't just to, list events, but to really unpack the nature of that reporting, what was being said, how, and maybe why.
Exactly. We're going to look at the claims made on Indian TV, put them side by side with what we understand actually occurred, or rather didn't occur in some cases, and we'll try to get into the potential motivations behind it all, and importantly, the possible consequences. Think of this as, your deep dive beyond the headlines.
We want to give you a clearer, more nuanced understanding, looking past that surface-level narrative.
Okay, so let's just jump straight into it, the claims. According to the Economist article, viewers were getting some seriously sensational stuff thrown at them.
Sensational is one word for it. We're talking about reports of Indian Navy strikes hitting Karachi's port.
Right, and the Indian Army supposedly crossing the international border.
Then there were claims Pakistan's prime minister had fled to a bunker somewhere.
And even, get this, a supposed coup, like Pakistan's army chief being deposed. It reads like a movie script, not a news report.
It really does. It sounds completely over the top. And the most critical point the article makes, and we need to stress this,
Go on.
is that none of this was confirmed by reliable international news outlets. And crucially, these specific events just did not happen, flat out.
Wow. So not just interpretation or spin, but fabricated events presented as news.
Precisely. These weren't different angles. They were presented as facts. And this was often accompanied by some incredibly, aggressive commentary.
Yeah, let's touch on the presentation, too. The article mentions, blaring sirens on screen, animated fighter jets flying around. It sounds like they were trying to create panic.
Well, it certainly paints a picture of a deliberately heightened atmosphere, doesn't it?
Right.
Maximum drama.
It likely makes it harder for viewers to think critically when you're bombarded like that.
Absolutely. And adding to the strangeness, the article notes a presenter actually reassuring viewers about their system of vetting information.
A vetting system? For news that was apparently just made up. That's quite the contradiction.
It is, which leads us nicely into the commentary you mentioned. If the facts were extreme, the opinions are something else.
Yeah, the article gives some pretty stark examples of the kind of rhetoric being used by anchors.
Really inflammatory stuff, like anchors literally demanding things like set fire to Karachi, blow up the entire city.
That's not news commentary. That's incitement, surely.
It certainly blurs the line, moving way beyond objective reporting into, dangerous territory, potentially just fanning the flames.
And it wasn't just aimed at Pakistan, was it? There was that other incident mentioned.
Ah, yes. The former army officer calling Iran's foreign minister a deeply offensive term, son of a pig, live on air.
Which actually caused a minor diplomatic incident, right?
It did. It just shows how this kind of on-air rhetoric can spill over and have real-world consequences, even internationally.
The article made that quip about Indian TV making social media look sane in comparison. That really says something.
It definitely highlights the extreme nature of what was being broadcast.
Okay, so we've got these fabricated events, this incredibly charged commentary. What does The Economist suggest is the logic behind all this? Why do it?
The article points quite strongly towards the perceived alignment of many Indian TV news channels with the ruling party, BJP. It suggests a key function of this coverage is essentially to bolster the BJP and attack its perceived enemies, whether that's political opponents or other nations.
So it's operating almost like a propaganda arm rather than independent news.
That's the implication explored in the article. This kind of relationship can foster what some call state-sponsored narratives, where the media prioritizes the government line over impartial reporting.
The article uses that phrase, viewers seeing it as world wrestling entertainment in suits. That's quite an image.
It is, isn't it? It suggests it's seen as a kind of performance of nationalism, maybe more about spectacle and political theater than, actual information.
Like putting on a show of strength and patriotism rather than informing people. What are the risks when news becomes performance?
Well, the article frames this recent hypernationalism not as a sudden thing, but as a culmination, a continuation of a trend seen over several years in parts of the Indian broadcast media.
Right.
A trend where perhaps sensationalism and political loyalty sometimes trump factual reporting.
Exactly. But here's where the article pivots in a really interesting way. It argues that even if the goal is to be nationalistic and support the government, this kind of reporting actually backfires. It fails to serve the national interest.
How so? That seems counterintuitive at first glance.
Well, it quotes a media critic, Manisha Pandey, who puts it very pointedly. If you're claiming to be a nationalist news channel, at least serve the national interest.
Okay.
And the argument is that this over-the-top, often false reporting actually ended up undermining India's own strategic goals and how it was perceived internationally.
Right. The article mentioned that India did carry out strikes in Pakistan after those attacks in Kashmir. But the official government messaging was careful, wasn't it?
Very careful. Diplomats, defense officials, they consistently described the response as non-escalatory. They were trying to manage the situation, prevent it from spiraling.
But the TV channels were doing the exact opposite. Precisely. They were actively ramping things up, portraying a much larger conflict. The article even mentions a guest on one show sort of praying for Pakistan to attack India just for the fun of it.
Just for fun, that's disturbing.
It completely undercut the government's message of restraint. So the article argues, instead of helping the state communicate its position, the TV coverage made India look like the aggressor, potentially undermining diplomatic efforts.
So it failed internationally. But what about the domestic audience? The article suggests harm there too.
Oh, definitely. Instead of providing clear, reliable information during a really tense time, these channels were amplifying disinformation, spreading rumors about drone swarms, mass suicide attacks, things that weren't actually happening on that scale.
And this was particularly bad for people living near the border, right? People actually dealing with blackouts, real drone sightings.
Exactly. They were left without credible information, fed a diet of hype and fear instead of facts they could use. It's a stark picture.
It creates this weird situation where, as the article implies, old-fashioned newspapers, even being a day late, might have been more reliable than live TV.
It seems that way in this specific instance. The article does give credit, though, to some private citizens and the government's own fact-checking service who are trying to push out accurate, real-time info.
A sort of counter-narrative happening elsewhere. Okay, but what about the BJP itself? Surely all this hyper-nationalist fervor helped them politically?
Well, that's the twist. The article argues it actually ended up being counterproductive for the ruling party, too.
How did that play out?
Because the non-stop, high-octane TV coverage built up this expectation, this narrative that India, under Modi, was on the brink of crushing Pakistan, wiping out terrorism completely. A decisive victory was imminent.
So it created unrealistic expectations.
Hugely unrealistic. So when President Trump announced a ceasefire on May 10th, the reaction wasn't relief. It was confusion and then outright anger among many viewers who'd bought into the TV narrative.
They felt let down because the final victory didn't happen.
Exactly. The article uses Arnab Goswami's furious on-air rant against the ceasefire as a key example. He was saying things like, "This is typical Trump overreach. Last night we were pummeling them. I don't buy this, and we will finish this."
Wow. Directly contradicting the government's acceptance of the ceasefire.
And this anger then spilled online. The article mentions angry nationalists attacking India's own foreign secretary and his family on social media, fueled by this media narrative.
So the media essentially whipped up a frenzy that the government then couldn't control or satisfy.
That seems to be the core argument. Modi later gave an address trying to project strength, downplay talks, and the BJP announced victory rallies. But the article concludes that ultimately, very few people in India actually bought the government's narrative of unqualified success.
And the irony, according to the article, is that the BJP can thank its own media cheerleaders for that erosion of credibility.
That's the final sharp point it makes.
Okay, let's try and summarize this. The fundamental issue here seems to be this massive gap between what was really happening during those India-Pakistan tensions and how it was portrayed specifically by parts of the Indian broadcast media.
A huge gap, yes. Driven by hypernationalism, perhaps a close relationship with the ruling party.
And this distortion wasn't harmless. It had negative impacts on India's image abroad, and it left its own citizens misinformed and potentially fearful during a crisis.
Absolutely. The article frames it almost as if some media outlets were waging a kind of information war, not just against an external enemy, but against their own audience, prioritizing a specific amplified narrative over facts.
And in doing so, possibly hurting both the national interest and, paradoxically, the very government they seem so eager to support.
That's the crux of it.
So this leaves us, and you listening, with a really important thought to mull over. In a world where media narratives can be so powerful, especially in times of conflict or tension, what are the broader dangers for democracy, for international stability, when getting the story right takes a backseat to pushing an agenda?
And maybe on a personal level, how do we as individuals trying to make sense of the world navigate this kind of information environment? How do we spot when news becomes something else entirely?
That's definitely something to keep thinking about long after this deep dive ends.